We are coming toward the close of Revelation. We are in Revelation 21 this morning, beginning. We have gone through the majority of the book of Revelation, the apocalyptic portion, if you will. Of course, we still have apocalyptic language used in chapters 21 and 22. But the difference in chapters 21 and 22, really beginning with verse 11 in chapter 20 and going through the rest of the book, is that all of this describes things that are yet to take place. Now, I do know, of course, that there are those that say that these things have already happened. But I don't believe there's any indication to indicate that in the text other than presuppositions of those that want to promote an agenda rather than teach what the Bible actually says. As we saw last week, 20:11 through 15 describes the great judgment scene that will take place at the end of time, where the books will be opened, and then the book of life will also be opened, and death and Hades will be cast into the lake of fire where the beast and the false prophet are, and the devil, Satan, will also be cast into the lake of fire, and those who are not written in the book of life will be cast into the lake of fire. So that is the prelude to what we're going to be seeing in chapters 21 and 22. Whereas we saw the destiny of those who are wicked, and the destiny of those who are persecuting the church, and those who are behind the persecution of the church. Now we're going to see, beginning with chapter 21, the destiny of those who are faithful to the Lord. Remember, this book was written primarily for the comfort and the consolation of brethren in Asia Minor in the first century who are now undergoing persecution and who will even undergo more persecution shortly. And so they had to be comforted, and they had to have encouragement first and foremost. And they would be the ones who would most naturally understand the message of the book that John was writing through inspiration. And so chapters 21 and 22 are going to serve as the ultimate encouragement to these brethren who are just now going through persecution of the church. So beginning of verse 1 of chapter 21, he says, "And I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea." Remember, in chapter 4, there was a sea of glass. In chapter 15:2, there was a sea of glass mixed with fire. The sea of glass separated the people of God from the throne. In chapter 15, the sea of glass, they were standing upon it or around the sea of glass. And now, in chapter 21, verse 1, there is no more sea. No more separation. There's no more separation. There's going to be intimate fellowship with God and with Christ. So this would indicate, if nothing else, that this is talking about something that is yet to take place. He sees there in heaven, he sees in his vision this new heaven and new earth. Now that brings to mind language such as what Peter says in 2 Peter 3, talking about the new heavens and the new earth. And that has given rise, by the way, to all sorts of speculation and even false doctrine. There are those that would say that the new heavens and the new earth of 2 Peter and of Revelation is a reconstituted, reconfigured earth. In other words, earth is going to be redone, remade to be eternal in nature. And that's what he's talking about. But there's absolutely no basis for that kind of supposition. In fact, if you look back in the history of the Restoration movement, you will find immediately one who was a prominent preacher in Nashville, Tennessee in the 19th century, Jesse Ferguson, who was probably the most popular preacher of any kind of church in the 1840s, 1850s. He became the preacher for the largest church in Nashville. And then what happens? He begins to come out with his speculations about eschatology based off of 2 Peter 3. He begins to intimate that everyone is going to be saved regardless. Universalism, in other words. And so it gets to the point where something has to be done. So Alexander Campbell himself is called down to Nashville by the brethren who were opposing Jesse Ferguson's teaching. Brother Campbell preaches and he writes several articles about this, and then comes down and preaches a series of sermons in Nashville and effectively stops that from spreading in the city. And Ferguson has to step down. Eventually he leaves the church and he dies outside of the church. He had adopted universalism based off of 2 Peter 3 and based in part off of here in Revelation 21. In other words, talking about Jesus going to preach to the spirits in prison, specifically there from 2 Peter chapter 3, and also about the new heavens and new earth. Whenever you get into eschatology, the doctrine of last things, you're going to find some way out in left field speculation and way out in left field teaching. We've already dealt with premillennialism and what it claims about the New Testament and how that Revelation does not give any support to premillennialism whatsoever. We've touched on the 80-70 doctrine throughout our study of Revelation and gives no support to the 80-70 doctrine. But then when you come to the new heavens and the new earth, what it really is referring to is a new dwelling place. And this is an eternal dwelling place. When Jesus said, I go and prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also. That indicates, at least to me on the surface of it, that there's going to be a new place that has nothing to do with this old earth that we're in. If I knew that this earth and everything in it was going to be the new heavens and the new earth, even it was reconstituted, I would be profoundly disappointed. Profoundly disappointed. But that's not how I read the New Testament. The New Testament indicates that this new dwelling place is going to be heaven itself. And it is even now being prepared by the Lord. And even He does not know the time or the day in which He will be coming to receive the faithful back to God. And so, this is what He is describing here in chapter 21, this new heaven and new earth. Now, verse 2 furthers the thought. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Now, here the image is mixed. We're talking about, of course, the new dwelling place, the new heavens and the new earth. But here in verse 2, he sees the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven. This indicates to me that he's talking about the church. In other words, this is coming down from heaven. What is he seeing? He is seeing the glorified state of the church. This symbolic representation of the holy city, New Jerusalem, is talking about the church in its glorified state. Or, if you want to put it another way, the church as it will be in heaven. Now notice he's saying the new Jerusalem. This is not talking about a reconfigured Jerusalem on earth by any means. That's not what he's talking about at all. Notice, she is prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Is the church not described elsewhere in the New Testament as the bride of Christ? Of course it is. So this indicates to me that this is speaking of the church in its glorified state. Verse 3. And I heard a great voice out of heaven, or out of the throne, saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and He will dwell with them, and they shall be His people, and God Himself shall be with them, and be their God, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying. Neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. Now, we have all been familiar with verse 4, because it is often cited at funerals, and rightly so, I believe. But we must not negate, or overlook, that is, we must not overlook verse 3. The tabernacle of God is with men. The tabernacle of God, the skene that's the Greek word for it. The skene, the tent, the tabernacle of God is with men. the dwelling place of God, if you will. And He will dwell with them. This is talking about intimate fellowship. This is talking about a close fellowship with God the Father, which we do not enjoy at present. We have fellowship with God and with Christ through the gospel. We have a relationship with the Father. We are His children, and we have a relationship with Christ. But we do not have this kind of relationship as yet. And yet, it's coming. It will be the case that God Himself will be with us. God Himself will be our God. And then the reality of verse 4 will be known. Don't you want to go to a place where you don't have to worry about taking your pain medication every day? Don't you want to go to a place where you don't have to worry about catching some sort of disease? Don't you want to go to a place where you don't have to worry about picking up some sort of virus, some sort of stomach bug like I picked up in Oklahoma at the tail end of the debate, where I was just sick as a dog for about 3 days and was dizzy for about 2 weeks afterward? Don't you want to go to a place where you don't have to worry about any kind of thing like that? Where you don't have to worry about singing, about crying, that is, being sorrowful over those who have passed away and those who are suffering? That you don't have to worry about anything like that. Well, that's the way heaven's going to be. No more death. No more sorrow. No more crying. No more pain. That's the former things. That's done. And yet we are to believe from the AD 70 advocates that all of this has already happened. That all this happened at AD 70 at the destruction of Jerusalem. Deliver me from such an idea. That is a complete misapprehension, a complete misapplication of clear teaching. What he's talking about is the glorified state of the church. That is, after the final judgment has taken place. And, verse 5, He that sat upon the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. And He said unto me, Write, for these words are true and faithful. I have a concept in my mind as John is writing these things. This is being described to him, of course, by Christ through the Spirit. And at this very moment here in verse 4 or verse 5, when he says, Behold, I make all things new, that John must have paused for just a moment in astonishment. This older man, by the time John's writing these words, he's probably at least in his 70s, maybe even in his 80s. He's writing these words and he's gone through all this kind of pain, all this kind of discomfort and crying and all of this. And now he's being told by the Heavenly Father, there's coming a time where all this is going to be passed away, and he just stops. And then God tells him, Write. Keep on writing, in other words. Write this down. Because, he says, these words are true and faithful. And he said unto me, It is done, or they are come to pass. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. Hearkening back to the terms used at the very beginning of this book. Alpha and Omega, the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. He's the A to Z in our terminology. And then he says, I will give unto him that is athirst of the fountain of the water of life freely. Interesting, is it not, that he uses language right here that directly connects with John chapter 4 and the woman at the well in Samaria. Isn't that what Jesus told the woman at the well? And he said, there's living water. And the woman was interested. Give me this living water that if I drink, I will never thirst again. And Jesus takes that opportunity to teach her about the nature of that living water. And he refers to it directly right here. I will give unto him that is athirst of the fountain of the water of life freely. There is a spring in Lamar County, Alabama. If you ever make your way to Lamar County, and by the way, you never just come across Lamar County, Alabama. You're either going there or you're lost. One of the two. If you ever go to Lamar County, Alabama, there is a little spring out east of Vernon. between actually Vernon and Millport called Blooming Grove Spring. Blooming Grove Spring is a natural spring that it runs off the side of a hill and has flowed that way for forever. Everybody that's been part of Lamar County knows about Blooming Grove Spring. And when you go to that place and you take a bottle or a canister, that the pressure of that water will just about take it out of your hand. It is that hard and that fast, and it's that good. It's really, really good water. And if you're really thirsty, Coca-Cola, which I love, will not suffice in comparison to Blooming Grove Spring. And I'm sure you know of other springs that you are familiar with from your childhood and growing up that are just like it. And that kind of water is what he's talking about. This water that quenches the thirst, that gives satisfaction. And it's the living water, the water of life that all people need to quench our spiritual thirst. And Jesus and God will give it to us. He that overcometh shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. Here's the ultimate destiny of those who overcome, of those who are faithful in spite of persecution and in spite of what's going to take place. This is your ultimate destiny. But now in contrast, verse 8, but the fearful and unbelieving, and the abominable, and murderers, and whoremongers, and sorcerers, and idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. Revelation 21:8 is the laundry list of all those morally foul, sinful people who will not inherit the kingdom of heaven, who will have their destiny in eternal hell. The fearful. That alludes to those who allow fear to rule their lives to the point that they do not follow the Lord. Maybe you're so fearful that you don't make a stand. Maybe you're so fearful that you don't speak the truth. Maybe you're so fearful that you decide to cast your lot with the world instead of casting your lot with the Lord. That's what he's referring to. All of us are going to have times where we're afraid. There's no sin in being afraid on occasion. But to allow fear to rule your life, to rule your spiritual life to the point where you are paralyzed and you make wrong choices, that's the kind of fear that he's referring to. The fearful and unbelieving. Of course, there are those that do not believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And there are those that claim that they don't believe in God himself. Those who refuse to believe will be judged by the Lord. No question about it. But then what about those who do not believe God's promises? Those who do not believe God because their lives are in contradiction to what they profess. Isn't that how the New Testament writers describe some of their day? Specifically Hebrews, specifically 1 Corinthians 10. In other words, don't be like those who fell in the wilderness. Why did they fall? Because of unbelief. You mean to tell me the people that were out there who with Moses didn't believe in God when they saw all the plagues and they saw the pillar of fire by night and the pillar of cloud by day? You better believe it, they didn't believe God. Because they kept those idols from Egypt squirreled away in their packs and in what they had carrying with them from Egypt. They didn't believe God because they murmured against him. They didn't believe God because they tempted God. They knew that God existed, yes, but they didn't believe him to the point that they were going to obey him. So those who are unbelieving, that's a very broad term referring to those who don't believe in God and Christ, and also those who profess to believe in God and Christ, but who do not obey the Lord. And then he says, the abominable. The abominable. That is an all-encompassing word that describes those who are just morally filthy. Have you ever known someone or some group of people that is just so foul that you didn't want to have anything to do with them? Because you just know from a distance, these people, I just don't want anything to do with them. Their speech, their dress, their behavior, everything about them, I just shun them totally. Abominable. That's what he's referring to. and murderers. We know the people that take lives, literally take lives, are going to be judged by the Lord. Both those who are in jail because of what they've done and those who have not been put in jail, who somehow have escaped the justice system, or maybe those of whom we are not aware who have taken lives. We understand that. And we understand the butchers such as Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini and other dictators that have taken hundreds of thousands and even multi-millions of lives because of evil philosophies and ideologies. We understand that. But then John brings it home to us when in his epistles he says, whoever hates his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. That brings it home, doesn't it? That means there are brothers and sisters that are going to be judged by the Lord because they literally hate their brethren. That's murder. And so he's talking not just about literal murder, he's talking about those who are guilty of murder in a spiritual sense. That's why it is so significant for us to examine all these terms. Whoremongers. Whoremongers refer to those who are sexually immoral specifically. Those who are engaged in all sorts of immorality on the sexual side. And we see that in droves today, do we not? We live in the most wide open society of my lifetime that I can remember. And it seems like anything goes these days, and anything is fair game to talk about. And idolaters. Idolaters. Those who literally worship idol gods. Of course, we know of those groups of people that do that still. But then also those who have covetousness in their heart. Paul says covetousness is idolatry, does he not? So if we have a covetous heart, would we not be lumped in with that idolatry he's talking about? I believe we would. And all liars. Well, sorcerers, I overlooked sorcerers. Sorcerers are those that engage in witchcraft and the black arts and put their trust in it. Put their trust in such. And we see a rise today in those that put their trust in that kind of thinking, that kind of philosophy. Well, he then wraps it up by saying all liars. That is very, very sobering to think. Well, I just tell a little white lie. Really? You really want to do that? You need to think about it for a moment. Yes, Abraham was guilty of telling a half-truth, which was a half-lie, about his wife, saying that she's my sister. Yeah, she was his half-sister, but no, she was his wife, so he was telling a lie. Abraham was not free of sin. But still, if we habitually tell lies and foster lies, then we're going to be held accountable. I never will forget, and a lot of times refer back to my dad. He's on my mind a lot, even though he's been passed on for several years. I think about him a good deal. Daddy one time had a big discussion with an area preacher who was of the more non-institutional variety, who made the claim that Gus Nichols changed his position before he died on the orphan's home. And I never will forget it. This guy was about to leave the house, and Daddy stopped right there in the middle of the living room and said, wait, hold on just a minute. Revelation 21:8 says, all liars will have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone. Are you right sure about that? Oh, yes. Gus Nichols changed his position before he died. So after that guy left, Daddy turned around, called up Hardeman Nichols, who was preaching at Columbus, Mississippi, and told Brother Hardeman about what this guy just said. Brother Hardeman chuckled and he said, Brother Hester, not only did my dad not change his position before he died, he was preaching the truth on orphans' homes and supporting orphans' homes out of the treasury about a month before he passed away. In other words, this guy that was in our house had told an absolute flat lie about a preacher who had been passed on for at least 15 years. Now, folks, that kind of blatant falsehood, people will be judged for at the day of judgment. And that's one reason why we need to make sure that we have our stories straight when we talk, when we speak to people out in the world, and when we speak to each other as brothers and sisters. Make sure that we tell the truth. We speak the truth. Our yea is nay and our nay is nay because it's this serious. They'll have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone. We know it's not a literal lake. We know it's not literal fire and brimstone. He's describing the second death, eternal damnation, eternal condemnation. And there came unto me one of the 7 angels, which had the 7 vials or 7 bowls, full of the 7 last plagues, and talked with me, saying, Come hither, I will show thee the bride, the Lamb's wife. Now we know he's going to be talking about the church. That is describing the church. And here, verse 10, he carried me away in the Spirit to a great and high mountain, and showed me that great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. Now, these are the details of what he saw in verse 2. He says in verse 2, big headline, I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Here, beginning of verse 9 and going through the rest of the chapter, he's going to tell us the details about what he saw. He is on this high mountain, unidentified mountain, and he sees the holy city descending out of heaven from God. Notice that. That's a marvelous picture, isn't it? John is allowed to see in this vision heaven and this city, this magnificent, glorious city coming down, and had a wall, great and high. A wall is, of course, indicative of protection. And this great and high wall indicates perfect protection, and had 12 gates. Normally, a walled city will only have 1 gate, maybe at the most 2 gates. But this city has 12. This indicates abundant entrance. In other words, all people are invited to come in. And at the gates, 12 angels. Notice this number 12. That number 12 is a significant number. We have 12 apostles, 12 tribes, and the like. So 12 gates with names, with the 12 angels, and had names written thereon, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. So you have the 12 tribes of the children of Israel written on it. This is indicative of the fact that the people of God are going to be there. The people of God of all ages will be there. Notice, on the east, 3 gates. On the north, 3 gates. On the south, 3 gates. And on the west, 3 gates. 3 gates on each side of the city. Now notice also he goes from east to north to south to west. You might think, well, what's the significance in that? This is exactly the opposite of the astrology of the day. The astrology of the day had the exact opposite order of direction. Now, you might think, what's the point in that? We're going to see the point when we come down to the stones that are mentioned, and I'll have something to say about that momentarily. Now, you probably know your astrological sign. I know my astrological sign. I'm an Aquarius. Do I put any stock in that? No. We are now told all the astrological signs are off a bit. No, I'm not going to give up my being an Aquarius. But still, people go to their astrological horoscope and they read that thing every day to see how their day is going to go or how their week's going to go. Well, now, preacher, you're getting to meddling. Well, the fact is, people put trust in that. And they read that horoscope to see what their future is going to be. Well, in the first century, they had a kind of astrology, not exactly like the astrology we know of today, but the astrological signs and the directions were significant for those that put their trust in it. So there is a veiled message in this, a hit against the astrology that was popular in the first century. Verse 14, and the wall of the city had 12 foundations. Not just one foundation, 12 foundations. This is indicative of a perfect spiritual foundation. And in them, the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So you see, you've got the Old Testament faithful represented in the names of the 12 tribes. In the foundations of the city, you have the New Testament represented in the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb, because of their faithfulness, obviously. Well, now, if this is a literal foundation with literal names of the literal apostles, what do you do about the Apostle Paul? Where's his name? He was an apostle. Matthias was appointed to take Judas Iscariot's place, and now you've got Paul, an apostle born out of due time. So actually, shouldn't there be 13 if you're going to be literal? Well, we know this is not literal. This is symbolic. Symbolic of all the apostles. And by the way, if Peter's name is literally on there, did Peter's name have 266 successors listed after his? Of course not. There are those that claim that Peter had all of his successors as pope. Peter was never a pope. But the fact is, this is all symbolic. The apostles are symbolized here as being the foundation of the city. Verse 15. And he that talked with me had a golden reed to measure the city and the gates thereof and the wall thereof. As we indicated earlier in our study, a reed is a royal cubit. This is a golden reed. This is a royal cubit measuring about 24 inches. A cubit, as we indicated, is the length from a man's elbow to the tip of his middle finger, exactly 18 inches long. That's how long my forearm is. That is a cubit. Well, 24 inches, 6 inches more, is a royal cubit. Or this reed, this golden reed that he's talking about. Measuring the city is indicative of protection. Measuring it for protection's sake. And, verse 16, the city lieth foursquare. Sometimes we've seen that song, "In the land of fadeless day lies the city foursquare." That comes right from here. This cube, it's a perfect cube, in other words. And the length is as large as the breadth. And he measured the city with the reed, 12,000 furlongs, the King James says. In our measurement, it would be 1,500 miles. 1,500 miles long, 1,500 miles high, 1,500 miles broad. He says the length and the breadth and the height of it are equal. This indicates that there is perfect room for the redeemed. There's no chance of not having enough room. There's not going to be a no vacancy sign put up in front of heaven. There's going to be plenty of room for everybody who has ever been faithful to come into that place. And this also brings to mind the holy place that's described in 1 Kings 6 about the measurement or the description of the most holy place, a perfect cube, measured both length, breadth, and height, all of it the same length. Verse 17. And he measured the wall thereof 144 cubits, according to the measure of a man, that is of the angel. In other words, this wall is 266 feet thick. 266 feet thick, if you're going literally. Again, this points to the protection of the city, divine and perfect protection. And the building of the wall of it was of jasper, the King James reads. Actually, the word there is a diamond. The building of the wall is of a diamond. And the city was pure gold, like unto clear glass. Pure gold. We don't have this kind of gold in existence anywhere in the world. This pure gold indicates purity, obviously, and beauty and holiness. The city is of pure gold. Think about what John was being allowed to see at this moment. This picture of the glorified state of the church in heaven, or heaven itself, if you will, this would almost overwhelm the senses for anyone to see this. And John is describing to us, as he was to these brethren, in language that we can understand, in terms that we can come as close as anybody could to understanding something that is completely undescribable. You know, what John is describing doesn't even come close to touching the hem of the garment about heaven. It comes nearer the way we would understand it. But the reality of it is going to be so much better. So much better. So, there are 12 stones that are described, beginning with verse 19 and going through verse 20. I'll read through these two verses and come back and talk about them here in a moment. And the foundations of the wall of the city were garnished with all manner of precious stones. The first foundation was jasper. The second, sapphire. The third, a chalcedony. The fourth, an emerald. The fifth, sardonyx. The sixth, sardius. The seventh, chrysolite. The eighth, beryl. The ninth, a topaz. The 10th, a chrysoprasus. The 11th, a jacinth. The 12th, an amethyst. So, these 12 precious stones are described. The first thing that comes to mind would be the breastplate of the high priest, described in Exodus 28, 17 through 20, with all these precious stones in the breastplate. But there's something else at work here. These stones, in the order in which they are listed through inspiration by John, these stones are exactly opposite the stones of the zodiac. In other words, the zodiac of the first century, the listing, the order of the stones was exactly opposite the order of what John describes here. Brother Burton Kaufman, in his commentary on Revelation, I think makes a valid point when he says that part of what God is doing is upending man's philosophy as identified by astrology and completely turning it on its head, saying that God is in control, not man. That could be part of what's going on here. But still, the stones themselves are here to emphasize the beauty of the city, the splendor of the city, the overwhelming nature of how this city appears. Think about these foundations in the walls of the city in your mind's eye. All these different colors, red, purple, green, yellow, all of that. How that would dazzle the eyes in connection with a golden city that has this great wall around it like a diamond. This is just going to blind you. You can think about it. If the sun or if light catches this city and all these stones, this is going to just about blind you because of the dazzling nature of it. And the 12 gates were 12 pearls. Every several gate was of one pearl. And the street of the city was pure gold, as it were transparent glass. Have you ever seen a pearl that big? Of course not. Where a gate is one pearl, that just boggles the imagination, doesn't it? And we know that a pearl is formed through suffering, is it not? Well, is this not indicative of the possibility that the entrance to heaven is by way of suffering? Could be part of it in this. And notice also, the very thing that people worship today, gold, is what they walk on in heaven. A street of gold. Notice he didn't say streets of gold, plural. Sometimes we say that and it's not really accurate. The streets of gold. No, it's a street, singular, a street of gold. And it's not literal gold. It's not a literal street of literal gold. Had one good old boy many years ago in a class that I taught in Revelation, when I made that point, said, David, I always was taught and I always was told we're going to have streets of gold up in heaven. We're going to be walking. No, it's not a literal street of gold. The reality is going to be so much greater. The reality is going to be so much beyond what we can even imagine. But this is describing in human terms spiritual heavenly things. So that's what we need to keep in mind when we read that. Verse 22, and I saw no temple therein. For the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are the temple of it. So the promise that was made all the way back in chapter 3, verse 12, is now fulfilled here in Revelation 21, verse 22. And the city had no need of the sun, neither of the moon to shine in it. For the glory of God did lighten it, and the Lamb is the light or the lamp thereof. No more need of the sun, no more need of the moon. The Lamb and God, that's the light. Isn't that wonderful to think that we will be in that kind of fellowship and in the very presence of God? And the nations of them which are saved shall walk in the light of it. All nations will be represented. People from every tribe and every ethnic group, every nationality will be represented there in heaven. And the kings of the earth do bring their glory and honor into it. Those great men, according to the world's thinking, who have been obedient to God and faithful to the Lord. Those who obey is what he's stressing here. And the gates of it shall not be shut at all by day, for there shall be no night there. Perfect safety, abundant entrance, open to all. Not restricted. Now that does not mean that universalism is true. Universalism is simply not true, because those who are disobedient, we've already been told, Revelation 21:8, they will be consigned to the lake of fire. So not all people will be saved by any means. But as far as who can come into heaven, there's no restriction as long as you are faithful to the Lord. Doesn't matter what kind of country you came from, or what color your skin, or how much money you've got in your bank account. It's because you are faithful to the Lord. That's what matters. And they shall bring the glory and honor of the nations into it. And there shall in no wise enter into it anything that defileth, neither whatsoever worketh abomination or maketh a lie, but they which are written in the Lamb's book of life. Here we are told specifically who will be a part of heaven. Those who are written in the book of life. That means this is restricted to faithful children of God, of all ages, by the way. Patriarchy, Mosaic, and Christian. Those who have been faithful to the Lord will be part of that great holy city, New Jerusalem, the glorified state of the church, heaven itself. That's who will be there. That kind of people I want to be around. These kind of people are people I want to be involved with. I don't want to be involved with people who are like the people described in Revelation 21:8. I don't have anything to do with them. And I don't think anybody in the right mind would want to have anything to do with those kind of people. And yet, heaven will be populated by the faithful. I'm so glad that that is the case. And I'm so glad that I don't have to worry about my background, have to check out my pedigree to find out whether or not I'm going to be a part of that place. Because if I'm faithful to the Lord doesn't look at me according to my ethnicity or according to my bank account or according to my nationality. He looks at me as to whether or not I've been faithful to Him. That is all that matters. That's all that should ever matter. And this would bring great joy, great comfort, great consolation to the brethren there in Asia Minor in the first century. They would be truly uplifted and encouraged by that message. All right.